Push this, that'll turn green.
Okay.
Explain what the contest is and what you're doing and how it works.
So this is the Agricultural Issues Forum. It's a competition within FFA. We are from the Cheyenne High Plains FFA at Cheyenne Central here. And what it is we come up with a specified topic that is a issue within the agricultural industry. This year we have chosen cattle emissions, specifically methane emissions, and how it relates to beef production and whether or not we should limit agricultural livestock production because of methane emissions. We have to come up with a 15-minute presentation with two sides, a pro and a con side, and deliver that presentation to a bunch of different companies or organizations. We've already done a lot of presentations so far, and we hope to compete at state and potentially win. We also have to answer 7 minutes worth of questioning at the end.
Okay, why don't you guys introduce yourselves?
I'm Lily Lewis. I'm from Cheyenne Central and I'm a junior.
I'm Kirsten Hofford. I'm a junior.
I am Sean Bassert, and I am a senior.
I'm Emma Berg. I'm also a senior.
I'm Abby Ford. I'm a senior as well.
I'm Coulter Brokaw. I'm a senior as well.
Okay, and then we're missing one student, so you're gonna see Abby read a second part that the young man just couldn't join us this morning, so if it looks a little weird, that's why. All right, ready when you are.
We will now be opening this hearing of the U.S. Senate Committee of Agriculture. I am Senator Lummis, and I will be your committee chair for today. The topic on today's agenda is, should cattle production be limited due to greenhouse gas emissions? Before we hear from our witnesses, I will give a brief overview of this issue. Greenhouse gases, or more specifically, methane gas, has been a hot topic for the past decade. Methane is a gas produced by cattle belching and cattle manure. Methane is a hazardous air pollutant that is dangerous to humans. It sits lower in the ozone layer and causes the displacement of oxygen, which can cause the possibility of suffocation. In 2005, the UN released a report related to cattle emissions compared to other sectors in the United States. Then, in 2008, a policy known as the Green New Deal was passed. This policy created more battles, but created more opportunities for climate-friendly regulations. Then, in 2021, the UN met for the Food System Summit Conference, also known as COP28. At this conference, the ban on livestock production and consumption was talked about. Shortly after, the UN faced a magnitude of backlash from countries in the southern regions of the world who rely on cattle production for their economy and culture. In the northern regions of the world, the European Union pushed for the halt of livestock production to help the environment in the future. We will first hear from Professor Kip Coddington from the University of Wyoming Law School, researcher Brent Kim from the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, and Ms. Nancy Lab from the North American Nature Conservancy to discuss the pro side of this issue, with ideas leaning towards the limitations and regulations of cattle production to help the environment in the future. On the con side, we will hear from Mr. Jeff Burnett from Carpenter, Wyoming, Professor Cody Gifford, who's a beef specialist and nutritionalist from the University of Wyoming, and Dr. David Kreutzer from Heritage Foundation, who are fighting for beef production to continue to help support our world systems. Our first speaker will be Professor Kip Coddington.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Carbon credits are just the beginning of a new era in climate-friendly agriculture. My name is Kip Coddington from the University of Wyoming Law School, and I have a background in chemical engineering and specialize in energy and environmental law. Massachusetts versus EPA specifically states that cow emissions fall under the category of greenhouse gases. Therefore, these cow emissions, specifically methane, are harmful to humans. The Clean Air Act discusses emissions related to motor vehicles. However, it applies to all greenhouse gases, not just motor vehicles. It's important to keep in mind the effect that methane has on the environment. According to the Environmental Defense Fund, quote, methane is a potent greenhouse gas that has more than 80 times the warming power than carbon dioxide over the first 20 years after it reaches the atmosphere. Even though CO2 has a longer lasting effect, methane sets the pace for warming in the near term. At least 25% of today's global warming is driven by methane from human actions, end quote. Regulating these emissions is one of the most important things that we as a society can do right now. Although we cannot cut cattle emissions completely due to the need for beef production, there are a couple different efforts being made to help the situation. Carbon credits and carbon digesters are one of these regulations. A carbon credit is defined as a permit which allows a country or organization to produce a certain amount of carbon emissions, which can then be sold if the full allowance is not used. When one company removes a unit of carbon from the atmosphere as a part of their normal business activity, they store it in a carbon digester. This can then generate a carbon offset, and other companies can then purchase this carbon offset to reduce their own carbon footprint.
Madam Chairman.
Mr. Burnett.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Faith, culture, politics. These are the morals I keep in mind when running my operation. My name is Jeff Burnett from Burnett Enterprises. I own and operate the largest dairy in the state of Wyoming. We run 6,200 milking cows who yield 68,200 gallons of milk a day. We also have a herd of 6,000 replacement heifers on standby. Along with the dairy, we're adding a 10,000 head feedlot to help our efficiency. I have a strong belief that this issue has only been brought up due to political and cultural agendas. Only 410 parts per million of the CO2 in the atmosphere comes from cattle. Yet cattle are being targeted for this rise in CO2 levels. For CO2 to become dangerous for humans, the levels must reach 420,000 parts per million. It has been proven that methane gas produced by cattle turns into CO2 within 10 years. CO2 is an important part of the ecosystem. Corn uses CO2 during photosynthesis. Corn is then digested by cattle. The methane emitted by cattle is then put into the ground by sequestration. On top of this, our cattle are grain-fed, so they produce less CO2 than the ruminants roaming the plains before them. Grass-fed ruminants do produce more CO2 than grain-fed ruminants due to their stomachs working harder. However, it is not feasible for many ranchers to grain feed their cattle. We spend $80,000 a day just on feeding our milking cattle. Many ranchers and farmers, including myself, pride ourselves in safe, environmentally smart practices. We share this belief that God gave us this land and He isn't making any more of it. We follow this every day when ranching and raising our cattle.
Madam Chairman. Mr. Burnett, I'm aware that you have a carbon digester. Can you go into a little more detail about that?
Madam Chairman.
Mr. Burnett.
We have a system that filters the manure and bedding from our barns, and it goes into the digester so that we can store carbon for companies in California who are over their allowed CO2 emissions. Because of regulations in California, many companies are paying ranchers to have a digester so that they can keep their production moving.
Researcher Brent Kim now has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Our Earth is warming and people are dying. Good morning, I'm Brent Kim from the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. In April of 2023, 69.7 million people lived in countries with rising temperatures. According to the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, 1,714 deaths in America were all caused due to heat-related causes. We fully support this shift towards a plant-rich diet and reduce food waste. We believe in order to cut our greenhouse gas emissions, reducing our beef consumption would be a crucial step. A growing body of evidence indicates that the industrial manner of animal production threatens rural communities, consumers and ecosystems, and compromises animal welfare. Currently, 4% of our U.S. population is vegan, and 6% of the U.S. population is vegetarian. Our goal is to increase this number while decreasing the amount of beef being consumed. My team and I have made this shift towards veganism and lowering our carbon footprint. The practices of ranching are just inhumane and cruel. We have confidence that shifting to a plant-based diet can not only sustain humans, but promote weight loss and lower the number of cattle being killed at mass rates.
Madam Chairman.
Professor Gifford.
Mr. Kim, you mentioned that you're doing research and have a goal. You are the Center for a Livable Future, so what are you doing to combat greenhouse gas emissions?
Madam Chairman.
Mr. Kim.
Good question. Thank you for asking. Some projects we've been working on include climate change and food system, food waste, and food waste resilience. There's been some talk about the importance of fertilizer due to growing crops for livestock in our growing population, but there's also been talk about the dangers of nitrous oxide fertilizer and what could be some alternatives for that for our environment.
Professor Cody Gifford now has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Why should we stop producing inaffordable, nutrient-dense food when millions are food insecure? I'm Cody Gifford. I'm a nutritionist and beef specialist at the University of Wyoming. My goal today is to inform you about the benefits of beef and cattle byproducts. People have been eating beef for thousands of years. Although opinions on red meat consumption have remained controversial, it's continued to stay a staple in the American diet. Beef is a nutrient-dense food containing proteins and amino acids that are essential for tissue health and metabolic needs. Mr. Kim mentioned that switching to an all plant-based diet would help with weight loss, but in fact, you'd be consuming more calories than you would with a healthy, balanced diet containing meat. Beef quality is improving worldwide, with lowering the fat content, but keeping the same nutritional value. In addition, cattle byproducts are seen everywhere today, from your lotion to medicinal sutures to the wallpaper hanging in your living room. Some argue that you can't truly be vegan due to this. In addition, the synthetic beef that we see today is not nearly as beneficial. Not only does it lack the essential nutrients that beef has, but it has over 20 different added ingredients to have the same taste and feel as beef. Taking away cattle would be taking away a vital part of human nutrition and diets. Is it worth killing a major food source for not only millions of Americans, but millions around the globe who rely on American beef in their diets?
Ms. Nancy Lab will be next.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Keep the grass right side up. I am Nancy Lab from the North American Nature Conservancy, and we pride ourselves in our work with regulating emissions through regulations on soil tillage, feed additives, and cattle genetics. We have been working with farmers, ranchers, and researchers all around North America to find new and reliable alternatives to cut greenhouse gas emissions. We recognize how vital ranching is and the need to continue feeding Americans. However, we believe that there is so much more we can do to support the reduction of greenhouse gases. As I mentioned before, our goal is to keep the grass right side up. Soil that is tilled emits 13.8 times as much CO2 as grasslands that are left alone. This is because the root systems in these plants store the CO2. So by uprooting them, we are putting that CO2 back into the atmosphere. We believe that the United States government needs to enforce feed additives into cattle production. UC Davis recently has done research saying that red seaweed could be a possible feed additive in cattle production. It has been seen to cut emissions in cattle up to as much as 82%. We believe that we need to enforce feed additives into cattle production.
Our next speaker will be Dr. David Kreutzer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think it's hypocritical that these moral grandstanders tell you what you can and can't eat while they fly around the globe in their private jets. Good morning. My name is Dr. David Kreutzer with the Heritage Foundation, and I don't believe that climate change is enough of a threat to create stifling regulations that put our food systems at risk. According to the EPA, U.S. beef production accounts for 3.7% of total greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. Advancements in nutrition and genetics has made the U.S. beef system the most efficient in the world, producing more beef with fewer cows. We produce 18% of the world's beef supply with only 6% of the global herd. The U.S. beef system is an integral part of American society, both economically and culturally. U.S. agriculture is a $1 trillion industry. Cows have been essential for the American experience for the last 200 years. We expanded west looking for more land to graze more cattle to feed our ever-growing population back east. By regulating this industry, rural communities will suffer and food costs will skyrocket due to the increased cost of production, and producers are already feeling that pressure. Mrs. Lab mentioned we need to feed everyone. With the global population topping 10 billion in 2050, regulating this industry will, by regulating this industry, rural communities. Mrs. Lab mentioned we need to feed everyone. Both the global population topping 10 billion in 2050. Regulating this industry will cause rural community. Yep. Excuse me. Regulating this industry into the ground seems like the wrong direction in creating food security on Earth. Is it not worth the marginal climate impacts to produce even more food? When implementing regulations, the dollar stops with the consumer. Those who are living paycheck to paycheck are not worried about the climate. They're worried about feeding their families. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, I move.
Professor Gifford.
I move.
Testimonies. The topic, should cattle production be limited due to greenhouse emissions, was the topic on today's agenda. We first heard from Professor Kip Coddington, who discussed how environmental laws play a role in this issue. Then from researcher Brent Kim, who discussed the importance of limitations on these greenhouse gases for not only for humans, but for the benefits of animals. Then, lastly, on the pro side, we heard from Ms. Nancy Lab, who talked about the importance of limitations and regulations to help the environment in the future. On the con side, we first heard from Mr. Jeff Burnett, who discussed the importance of beef in the ecosystem. Then from Professor Cody Gifford, who discussed the importance of beef in the American diet. Lastly, on the con side, we heard from Dr. David Kreutzer, who discussed how important beef is in the economy and supporting our world systems. The committee will meet back in 4 weeks to continue this discussion. Meeting is adjourned.
We've done this before, and politician judges tend to be long-winded. So I'll preface with that and request that everybody try to keep their question to a limited amount so that these young people, because I think that's what they'll have in a real contest, is a quick questions and not long drawn-out speeches. So go ahead, who's first? Representative Davis.
This is just a for-your thought, especially for the beef industry. We talk about grass. And then the cow naturally releases the methane and CO2 back into the atmosphere, giving us a byproduct of use called beef, which feeds the nation. What's your thoughts on that?
I think that's the main.
It's okay, you can keep that one, this should do it.
Representative Alderman.
You guys get lost. But 200 years ago, statistics show that we had up to 180 million bison. Did they belch and did they gas? And if they did, was that a problem then, or is that just a problem now?
So although in the past we do have had other ruminants like bison roaming plains, and there's been a lot of them who did belch and end up releasing methane, the problem is with the industry now, there's a lot more things contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, such as motor vehicles, such as any sort of factories that are releasing any sort of smoke into the air. That's not what the main concern is from the past. We're concerned about how we can save the planet now and what kind of ideas we can do to reduce global warming.
Follow-up, Representative Alderman.
So maybe we ought to get rid of cars, not cows.
The only issue with getting rid of cars, how are people going to get anywhere? In certain areas, you may be able to walk, but areas like Wyoming, some of us may live 20 minutes out of town. That's a 3-hour and some odd minute walk if you want to get somewhere. I don't think anybody who enjoys their life is going to be willing to walk that far every single day to get to school, to get to work, or just to go into town to get food.
I suggest a methane digester as a form of transportation.
Remember the beside you guys.
Representative Banks.
Thank you. So we heard testimony that beef only contribute to 3% of the admissions. If we take all of the suggestions, what is the projected amount we will decrease those admissions by, and will that make a significant difference in those admissions?
When we spoke to Dr. Kreutzer from the Heritage Foundation, he said if we were to eliminate all carbon in the United States by 2100, we would lower the temperature by 0.2 of a degree.
Any other questions? Yes, Representative Davis, go ahead.
Chairman, this is for Chip. You were talking about that. Humans produce 25% of the carbon, is that right? And 75%. What is the source of the other 75%? How is it occurring?
So in my speech, I talked about how methane is driven by human actions, and that's specifically talking about cattle ranching or any sort of other area where humans are driving any sort of emissions into the air. The other 75% comes from any sort of factories which are still driven by humans, but not all of them are as direct as ranching and everything else like that.
To add on, we also see some of those emissions from natural disasters, and so fires are one of those really big contributors. And so recently we just saw a big fire out on Horse Creek, and we can just only imagine the amount of CO2 and methane that was emitted from that, as well as we see that with certain bodies of water, if there is an outbreak in a certain bacteria, that can actually cause methane emissions as well.
Representative Alderman.
I love you. Okay, so if we do not have a good forest program and we let our trees grow old and die and they catch fire, that's contributing a whole lot more than cows, correct?
Absolutely. A couple years ago, we saw that massive fire in the Snowy Range that burned millions of trees, and it burned for probably a couple weeks straight in, I remember the smoke cloud. It was massive, and that's part of our issue is, our side of the issue is, how can we look at humans that are saying, and all of our activities and compare it to natural disasters and natural phenomenons in our ecosystems?
Representative Banks.
Being that this is Wyoming and we're kind of old fashioned, has these processes that you've presented to us been presented to some of these ranchers? And how well have they been accepted? And are we seeing more and more ranchers utilize any of these digesters or any things that you talked about?
The Renettes, which is a very local ranch, it's over in Carpenter, they actually do have a digester, but the main issue with those is that they're government regulated. So a lot of ranchers, especially in Wyoming, don't like being told what to do by the government. So that's a main issue on our side, is that we don't want more government regulation on our ranches, and the government is heavily involved in those digesters.
To come at that from a pro side, I just want to say that with the feed additives, we are seeing pieces of almonds that have seemed to limit methane emissions. With the red seaweed, there's pills that the cattle can take once every 6 months, I believe is what it is, that are supposed to be government incentivized rather than subsidized, if that makes sense. Rather than trying to regulate it and enforce it directly, the government is trying to incentivize it and make it seem like the ranchers would want to do this, just to make it seem like it's worth their while, because it would be worth their while coming from that perspective.
Would any of you have research numbers on what the eventual net carbon that comes out of these cattle are? We have them as a primary digester, and then we've got Burnett's feed dairy has a secondary digester. What would these cows on the range, because most people don't have them collected that way, what would a cow on the range eventually do concerning carbon?
I don't believe that we have an exact number, but the rangeland cattle are producing more than the cattle that we see in feedlots. Because they're ruminants, they're working harder when digesting grass rather than grain. So they're producing more, but there's not really an option for something like a digester when they're on a range, obviously, because you can't collect the manure and sequester that.
So I think we're kind of done with
Yeah,
questions.
time, and that's 7 minutes, which is
That went just right,
yep,
and I wasn't done,
oh.
but that's okay. We can continue on, or did you want to say something first?
No, if you have more questions, the other thing that we would ask is if you guys have ideas on speaking or answering questions, part of this is to practice for the state. And then if we win state, the national competition, you guys are all professional speakers. So if you have any. I was gonna say long-winded, and I did change my mind. So if you have any speaking tips for these juniors and seniors, that would be really helpful as well. Ideas on how they can make their presentations better.
I would have one question for you, especially you, Chip, when you start out and you present the findings of the UN, the scientific data, does that ever come into question? What are you using to since that's your backing on this altogether here?
Kind of elaborate on the question, like more what you're asking.
Okay, there's pros and cons on every study, okay? And you're citing specifically the UN as but you don't give the other side of other scientific data that would debunk that, for instance.
So what I am citing is for my side specifically. I am citing the issues that are related to cattle emissions, specifically methane, and I want to cite the facts that play towards my side. Although there are plenty of other facts on the other side, I believe that this side has a little bit better knowledge. And like I said, Kip Cottington is a law professor who has a background in chemical engineering. So I think that any sort of research that he's doing or anything that he is pulling is going to be factual correct, and it's going to be a strong piece of evidence, and that's why I use those sides of it.
Okay, I would.
I also want to say, though, that we only got 15 minutes. And if these guys said every pro and con, this would be like 4 hours. So we gotta, so we
Like
kind of
the
had to,
legislature.
yeah. So we kind of had to pick and choose. And so we did not get into this merits of this scientific study or that scientific study, because we just simply can't in a 15-minute presentation. There's no way.
So you asked about going forward. I was impressed. I don't know where you sit personally on these topics, but I think you did a good job of portraying your side. Bring it up, keep going, okay? Sell your point, whatever it is. Bill, the gentleman down here on the end, he got flustered. He handled it so well that he just handled it very well. And he got his points back and he went on, his presentation from the start was probably one of the best I'd heard, but then he got flustered, but he handled it well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've watched this for quite a while, and I don't know if at this stage that I've ever seen a team very much more polished than you are. Continue to work on that. Something that happened, this was years ago now, but in '06, our daughter Lori was in ag issues at nationals, and they were somewhere in the semis and in the heat of things. And one of the judges, theirs was livestock on public lands. That was their issue. And the judge, first thing out of his mouth, he said, "Wow, I didn't know there were livestock on public land." So this is a bomb that just kind of be prepared for something like that. And I think most of you could overcome that with what you know and the knowledge you have, but be ready for the strangest things to happen, because you'd expect a team of judges to know somewhat what the ag issues are, and they don't I'm not sure they necessarily know. That's kind of what any more?
I'd like to say one other.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
You guys are one of the things that really make me proud to see you guys. And I'm really glad you're here, and I know that you guys do well every year, and I think this year you're going to do even better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we can't do much better because Wyoming doesn't have a lock on national championships, but we've had
Our fair share.
But this year's gonna be better.
All right. well,
Oh, no, these kids are great.
Yeah, thank you. John Winters, representing.
May I just ask a question here? You guys did great, and my question has to do with the number of girls boys in FFA now. I have 2 girls that were very active in FFA, and it just seems like there's more girls than boys. Do you have any thoughts or ideas on that? What we can do to change that, maybe? I'm glad you girls are there because you rule the roost anyway. We need some young men in this program as well.
I think it's just something we can always work on. Honestly, if you look back 20, 25 years ago, it was more guys than girls. We don't know exactly what happened, why there was a huge switch, but lately it has been more girls than guys, and I personally know that from experience. I'm the only guy on our chapter officer team, and it's pretty weird at times, but I think the best thing that we can do is just encourage more guys to get into FFA, get them into more competitions. That's really what got me into FFA, is starting off with chapter conducting and really learning what FFA was. And I also think it's a pride thing almost for guys. I think a lot of guys find it embarrassing that they're in FFA or think that it's a weird group of kids. We are a weird group of kids, embrace it. I don't think that it matters, but a lot of people care about what other people think. And I think that's one of the driving factors of why there's less guys in FFA, but I try and get as many guys to come to meetings, to come to activities, to be involved as I can, but some of them just don't wanna listen and just wanna do their own thing, so.
In 1970, the discussion was just beginning, that's when I graduated high school. The discussion was just beginning to allow girls into FFA. And that's kind of where it started. Then generation later, my wife and I had 3 daughters, and we were so glad girls were allowed in it. The daughter who was on the judging team, it was all girls. So I applaud all of you, men and women both. It's just leadership isn't a gender deal at all. It's, thank you. Oh, Representative Holloman.
You guys and your coach are rock stars.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One final comment. My granddaughter is in FFA, and the reason why I believe there's more women in there, they're harder to convince than men are. Women can have a pretty set mind as far as they're going. I've tried to convince my granddaughter, and it's not working.
Or your wife.
Well, that's where it came from.
Well, thank you.
Thank you guys.
All right, so could we get a picture of all of you together so that we can put it in our portfolio, please?
You want us back behind them or in front?
I think behind
Probably
them.
behind
Yeah.
you.